Now you can just present as normal. Just leave that, present to everyone, and you can just minimize it. You just continue actually.
Okay, so the people live streaming
They can hear you.
eventually, if they haven't stopped, if they haven't lost heart yet. Okay, so you're on. Okay, well, I hope they had. Okay, and
It says live, so
lives, hopefully. Okay,
yeah, there's a
all right. Okay, so welcome to everybody. We all online, yay! And I still not sorted the song. But anyway, here we are. Right. Oops. Where's my PowerPoint? Gone. There we go. The question is why do countries actually trade? Okay, so that is what we're busy discussing. So we want to know why trade, why bother, is it worth our while? I'm going to leave that on. I'll just work on that just now on the document camera. Okay, so we're in chapter 16, and we know that trade is good for the economy. It's because we can grow faster if we have access to other countries' resources, and we can actually use their markets. So it comes from two sides. So you can't only think if you only want to export, you don't want to import, then that's not trade. So trade goes both ways. But how did it all start? So this tells us, why is this not big? This needs to be like that. I don't like to see all that. Maybe, huh? No. You just do it. All right. Anyway, weird. Just ignore the other stuff. Adam Smith, which you know is called the father of economics, he said that it's better for a country to produce the things that they do make best. That's the whole notion of specialization. And I like this quote actually, if you think in his days, it's 1776, and it is such high English in terms of the prudent master and all those things. And they say it's actually silly if what works for the individual is not to do everything ourselves, but to specialize. That's what you guys are doing. You're busy specializing so that you can use your comparative advantage in order to produce and do what you do best, and then you purchase the other things. It's much better. Otherwise, I have to be here, and I have to make my own clothes, and I have to produce my own food, and blah, blah, blah. It's better if we all specialize. And he says if that is true for a person, it should also be true for a country. And that is the notion of trade. So he says, if we have an absolute advantage, that is the advantage we have over another country, something we make better in absolute terms than they do, then it's better for us to produce that thing, export it, and import the things that they make better. Makes sense, right? So the things that we have a disadvantage in, we will then import. Things we have an advantage in, we will export, right? So that makes sense. But then the question is, what if there's a situation that you're in a small country, often small countries, and we produce things well, but we do not have an absolute advantage in anything. We produce okay-ish, but we don't produce better than other countries. Can we still trade? And that's when the other guy said, okay, let's look at that. If you are not good at anything that well, you don't present, can you actually still trade? And Ricardo says yes. Yes, that is okay. Even though you don't produce anything really that much better, you can still have a comparative advantage. Okay, so now you need to turn to table, your table 16 point, it's actually figure, it's not table, it's figure 16.1. There is no table. Figure 16.1. I changed it. This must be the wrong version. Sorry, because I changed many things. This is sad. Anyway, we'll see. Figure 16.1. Now in figure 16.1, we work here with two countries. The one is Germany and one is South Africa. And we say, okay, but let's say this is, remember the PPFs, production possibility frontier. So we say that this is Germany's axis. We have barrels of wine and number of cars, okay? And then we have the production possibility curve. You see that we have constant opportunity cost. Is this coming back? No. PPS, remember? We did this at the beginning of the year, probably. Oh, this is long and long ago. Yes. But remember, if you use all your resources and you use only two things in this economy, then those gives us that gives us, oh my goodness, it's a long week, it's only Wednesday. That gives us the production that we can have. So in Germany, if they use all their resources, all their laborers, only producing barrels of wine, they can produce 8 barrels of wine. South Africa, if we use all our resources, we can produce 6 barrels of wine. So who has an absolute advantage in wine? Germany. Absolutely, they're better. Right. So if they use all the resources that produce cars, then Germany, you see 2 on the horizontal axis, Germany would be able to produce 2 cars. South Africa used all our resources, we could produce 1 car. Right. So who has an absolute advantage in the production of cars? Germany. So Germany has an absolute advantage in both wine and cars. Can we trade? The question is, can we trade? What should we do?
Put German wine on our shelves and South African wine on theirs.
And then who makes cars?
Put South African coffee there as well.
We'd have to decide what to do. Okay, we can use that now and they say, okay, there's the absolute values, but now we want to know what is the comparative advantage. Where is the comparative advantage? What should we do? See, sort of we can perhaps trade, but if we look at what is comparative advantage, the advantage that one country has over another in terms of opportunity cost. Remember that notion? Okay, so what is the opportunity cost for Germany of producing 1 car? If they have not produced cars and they now want to produce 1 car, how many barrels of wine do they need to give up? 4. Okay, so the opportunity cost for Germany producing 1 car is 4 barrels of wine. Remember that. And for South Africa, what is the opportunity cost for 1 car? If we want one car, we have to give up 6 barrels of wine. For every 1, we need to give up 6. So our opportunity cost is 6. Whose opportunity cost for cars is the greatest? Now, Germany's opportunity cost is 4. South Africa's is 6 of producing 1 car. You all get that? So, for who is it cheaper to produce cars? For Germany. So, it would be beneficial for both countries if Germany produces the cars and South Africa produces the wine. Okay? I can explain to you now. Right. How do we do that? We calculate the opportunity cost, just like you've done before, right? So then we can ask, and we're quickly going to look at these questions. How do we then determine the price? They call that price the terms of trade. The terms of trade is the difference between the import and export prices. Yeah, we'll look at that as well. That's the terms of trade. And then what are the advantages, the gains from trade in this case? Just to see that it actually is beneficial. And then how do countries know where they have a comparative advantage? Okay, so this is what you're going to do. This is your homework. You have to create your own example of comparative advantage, like the Germany and South Africa one in the textbook, right? So what I'm now going to do is to show you just the notion of what it means in terms of two people, but it's also true for two countries. In order to say what are the advantages. Okay, so you see that in your textbook in the definition, comparative or relative advantage, before and after those graphs. Okay, so let's explain quickly. Elizabeth and Brian, you can see as two countries or two people. Let's just look at specialization and the benefits from trade. Trade would be the transactions they can engage in. Right. So let's say we have Elizabeth here and Brian there. If they use all their energy and effort, Elizabeth would be able to produce 20 bread. And if she uses all her effort in apples, she would be able to produce 20 apples or anything in between. Right? For Brian, if he puts all his resources into making bread, he can do 10 bread. And he can make 30 apples if he focuses on apples or anything in between. Okay. So what are the opportunity costs? What are the opportunity costs? Can you draw those two lines? Try quickly. Do the same thing for Brian and for Elizabeth in terms of what we had for Germany and South Africa. This is what you need to do for your own country that you choose. And we have production. We have production 2020 and 1030. No, you can do at the back of this if you want, if you need paper, but this is something else that you can do at the back if you want. Okay, so what are the opportunity costs? So you have Elizabeth and you have Brian. And on the axis, you would have bread and apples. And it doesn't matter, let's put bread there, bread on that vertical and apples on the horizontal. There we will have 20, 20, here we'll have 10, 30. No, it's the other way around. Oh my goodness, all right. Okay, so who has an absolute advantage in apples? Right. Who has an absolute advantage in bread? Elizabeth. Okay, that's easy. So we have absolute advantage here. But we could now look and say, okay, but what for Elizabeth? She does 20 and 20. So what should she do? Should she trade or should she stay? Brian produced apples. He has an absolute advantage in that. So actually, it makes sense for them to trade. So Elizabeth's opportunity cost is 1 bread for every apple, and Brian's and 1 apple for every bread. Brian's opportunity cost is 1 bread for every 3 apples. So that means it is 1 apple is equal to a third bread. So for every 1 apple, he has to give up a third bread, or for every 1 bread, he needs to give up 3 apples. Can you see that? So that's our opportunity costs. So now somewhere between this, they can actually both gain from trade. Let's look at those gains. Elizabeth, at the moment, would be in the middle there, producing 10 and 10, right? So if there's no specialization and no trade, she, let's say, consumes 10 bread and 10 apples. Okay, that's that middle point that she produces. For Brian, he does 5 and 15. Where do I get that? That would be the middle point. So you say, let's say that's her consumption, and Brian is at 5 and 15. So those 2 points, that's what they can produce and consume if they do not trade. Okay? But now, let's say Elizabeth specializes and she goes, or Brian makes more sense, he specializes, he makes apples because he does it much better than Elizabeth. So he produces 30 apples, and Elizabeth produces 20 bread. Can you see what can happen? This is a possibility. If that is the case, they have 30 apples and 20 bread that they need to distribute. So if we distribute it in that sense, we can say, okay, let's say Brian increases his consumption of bread to 8. He's used to 5, so he's happy with an extra 3. Elizabeth gets 2 extra, so they gain already 2 and 3. And the same thing with apples. Elizabeth can add 2 apples. Brian can consume more apples. He's good at apples. Apples are abundant where he produces, and he uses more. Can you see that they both gain? And what is true for the individual is true for countries. If we have open borders and we all produce the things that we produce best, we can get that. So global consumption can increase because the production becomes more efficient. As the resources move towards there where they are put to best use. Okay, any question here? You're right with this? Okay, does it make sense? All right, so the question then, can we always have beneficial trade? Not always. Only when there's differences in prices. And where does the price come from? When the opportunity cost is different in the 2 countries. If it's exactly the same, they won't benefit from trade because then the terms of trade will not benefit anybody. The terms of trade normally in between the prices. You'll see that if you look at the graph in the book, at the bottom of the description, they say that they talk about the price in between. Okay, this is just the terms of trade in the textbook. It uses the export price divided by the import price. That's at the end, but we'll get back to that. Okay. What I want to get to is the trade restrictions, and that's the handout I gave you. I'll show that on the screen shortly. I just need to open that. So what instruments would government use, and what are the implications for that? So let's have a look at some of the instruments. You'll see that in your textbook as well. It's listed under trade policy 16.3, and there's a whole range. Today I want to tariffs, quotas, subsidies, non-diverse exchange controls, exchange rate policy. Today I just want to get it working, getting the micro going, so that we're going to look at the effect of tariff on an imported product. I just quickly need to open, the other file so that the people on streaming can see as well and work with us. Okay, so your question is, like you see there, what will happen what happens when government levies a tariff on an imported product like a motorcycle? Okay, so what do you think? How does it work? What is a tariff, first of all? Tell me quickly. A tariff is a what? If there's a tariff on motorcycles, what does government actually say? It's a tax. It's a tax. So that means for every motorcycle that's imported, they need to pay a specific percentage of the price or specific value they have to pay towards the government. That is our tariffs, okay? And SARS will collect that, and that goes towards the government revenue. Remember in the budget, when you did the budget, you had government revenue from taxes, and then one of those, that circle that you saw with all the components, one of them was for customs tax. This is it. This is tariffs. Okay. So let's look at what happens. So we want to know what will happen to the, so that is, I just need to quickly go there. So what the impact will be is we're going to see that, and I want you to now think, the consumer surplus is going to go down, the producer surplus is going to increase, and some other stuff is going to happen. Where do you see this? In your textbook in chapter 5, so you have to make a note, or go to in your textbook to chapter 5. Chapter 5, figures 16 and 17 actually explains this, right? So I want you to do the following. Let's quickly draw a market for a motorcycle. So we're looking at the domestic market. That's what you will see in figure 16 in chapter 5. I'm just going to do it a bit bigger. So on your graph, let's say, right, we have the price of the motorcycle and the quantity. This is the domestic market. So we have the horizontal axis, quantity, vertical price, and in this market, we have the demand for and supply of the motorcycle. And that is in equilibrium, remember micro, at a specific price, let's call it B1, and a specific quantity Q1. That would be domestic market price, am I right? But if we had an open economy, open trade, why are we importing motorcycles, for instance? Why do you think? Do we import it at a cheaper or a more expensive price? We import because it is beneficial for us, so we import because it is cheaper. So we look at the world price. That would be the world price. Let me call that PW. At the world price, that would be the price that we can get it for. At that price, with no intervention from government, we would then let's call that Q4, I'll call that one QE, and then I can make this one Q1. Q4 will be the quantity demanded, and Q1 will be the quantity supplied. You with me there? Okay, so that would be the situation before the tariff happens. The price of the import, the world price, is lower than the equilibrium price in the country. So therefore, we can say that consumers will demand this, the suppliers will produce or supply that. What component, how much will be imported? You think? At that price. The demand is here, the domestic supply is there. So what is imported? The difference. Okay, so we don't have equilibrium in the domestic market, but we have imports. So the difference between Q1 and Q4 will be imported. Okay, so my imports will be that bit. Right. You with me? Hello? Am I losing you? Talk to me. You understand what's happening here? Government levies a tax. So we need to first see where we come from. If you look figure 5.15, you'll see there's a Q1 is the quantity supplied, and Q5, actually in the textbook, the quantity demanded in this market at the world price, and the difference between Q1 and Q5, or Q1 and Q4 on our graph there, is the imports. Are you figuring what's happening here? Everybody on that page? Okay. Then what will happen if the government increases the tax? Now there's a tariff. What would happen, you think? What do they say? For every, let's say, for every motorcycle imported, there's a tax levied. What will happen to the price? We add the tariff, there's the tariff, to the price. So for every unit, this is per unit, that is the price. Let's call it PT. Do they call PT? Yeah, it's sometimes to W plus T. PT, and that would be the price now. Okay? So what happens in the market with the imports? The quantity demanded will drop, in my case to Q3, I think in the textbook to Q4, and the quantity supplied in the domestic market will increase to Q2, so imports will decrease a little from, let's call that IM2, that was IM1. Okay, so that's what happens. But now I first want to ask you, what will happen to consumer surplus? So in this first box, I want you to show me the consumer surplus. And remember consumer surplus. What was it? What will it be now? Quickly. Talk to each other. Show. Ask. What happens to consumer surplus? Moves from where to where? That's point 1. We want you to understand what is the impact of the tariff on employment. What is consumer surplus again? Consumer surplus is the difference between what the consumer is willing to pay and what they actually pay. Do you remember that? I know micro's been long and long ago. And producer surplus is the difference between what the producer is willing to supply at and what he actually receives. Okay, so show me on that graph for the tariff what happens to the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. So your first graph, consumer surplus, and the second one, producer surplus. Okay, consumer surplus was where? Consumer surplus would be above what the consumers are willing to pay and what they actually pay. What are they willing to pay? They're willing to pay everything below the demand curve. So that whole triangle from the vertical axis above the price, world price, right up to the point of the quantity demanded. That yellow triangle, can you see that? That was consumer surplus. You with me? Okay, now the price increases to PT. What happens to consumer surplus? Show me. Do yourself a favor, draw it now. Don't just think it, draw it. If you do it now, then you get it right in the test. Okay, so the surplus now moves to above the price. So now it's PT. And it goes again below. So the orange there is now the consumer surplus. So the yellow was consumer surplus 1. The orange is consumer surplus 2, which is smaller than 1. Okay, now do the same thing for yourself with the producer surplus. Show what happens to producer surplus on your graph in number 2. You turn the page, 2 says what happens with producer surplus. Just quickly show what happens to producer surplus. So in your second graph, you will draw your producer surplus will decrease or increase. What is producer surplus? The difference between what the producers are willing to supply at and what they're actually supplying. I'm just going to do this one in yellow. At PW, below PW and above the supply line, that would be producer surplus 1. And producer surplus 2. At PT, what happens to producer surplus? Okay, yeah, it increases, and you'll see that. Because the price line goes up, the quantity supplied will increase, and therefore we get an increase in producer surplus. So now the producer surplus will be below PT and above the supply line. So that portion would be PC2 produces surplus of S. Sorry, where do I get the C from? Produces surplus 2. The blue. You with me? Okay, everybody there. Any questions about consumer producer surplus? Right, so you remember the sort of. Okay, now we use that and we say, all right, what is the impact? So now I want to say the impact of a tariff. Firstly, what happens to consumer surplus? So fill in that one. Consumer surplus will? Consumer surplus decreased. It moved from CS1, the yellow, to the orange. So it's now only the orange. The orange is smaller than the yellow was, right? So consumer surplus decreased. Producer surplus increased from yellow to blue. That is higher. So on your form you can see. And now what else happens? Okay, that is wrong. That's figure, this is the changes I made that was not included here. That must be just change it there. That must be figure 517. Figure 517. Okay, 517. Okay. Now this graph that we've drawn, we put it all together. So there you have this whole thing now, right? So let's just do it neatly on that one. Now I have a nice big one. So we know what happened to producer surplus and consumer surplus. So we had our product, we have demand, supply, and we start with the world price. The 5.5. BT. Oh, that's one, sorry. Please. And now I know what happened. Okay, so you're all with me there? Oops. No. So this tariff firstly decreased consumer surplus. Consumer surplus decreased with that bit. So you see what I'm drawing here is the decrease in consumer surplus. Am I right? Because it moved from that triangle to the top triangle. Okay? So firstly, I have the minus in consumer surplus. Right, that's that yellow bit. Then we have the producer surplus increasing. Okay, producer surplus increased. And that bit is the increase in producer surplus. Am I right? Okay, so part of that goes to the producer. So we have plus producer surplus. Can you see that? Right? Now what else happens? If you go down, how do we say what's the impact of the tariff? The consumer surplus, we said, decreased. The producer surplus increased. What happened to the price of the product? The price went up from PW to PT. Okay. What happened to the quantity? The quantity. What quantity? Quantity demanded decreased and quantity supplied domestically increased. Can you see that? So the consumers are consuming less because why? The price is more. We don't want to buy the more expensive motorcycles. And the producers are producing more. Why? Because they can now afford the cost. Remember where the cost comes from? So the cost they can afford because they get higher income, because the price is now higher. So now the average price is higher. Okay, so what happened to price? Price went up because of the tariff. What happens to quantity? Quantity demanded decrease, the quantity supplied domestically increase. And that causes the consumer surplus to decrease and the producer surplus to increase. Actually. Right? So what happens to imports? What happened to imports? Imports was between Q1 and Q5. That was imports initially. Now imports is between Q2 and Q4. That's the quantity imported, that bit. Because that's the quantity demanded, that's the quantity supplied, that's what the international market supplies. Do you get that? That's IM2, let's say, right? So imports decreases. Okay, now I want you to discuss and tell me what will happen for government. What does a tariff do for government? They get money. Can you show on the graph what the size of the money will be? Yeah. What do they get? Think it through. They get a tax per unit that is imported. Think it through. They get the tax. The tax is the difference between the world price and the tariff price. That's the tariff. And for every unit that we import, they get that tax. So how much do they get? Government will get the tariff. The difference between PW and PT is the tax. And how much are we importing? That number. And if I multiply that, that goes towards government. Okay, check chapter 5, figure 16 and 17. Bring your paper back on Tuesday after tomorrow and the weekend, and then we'll just wrap this up to say what the net effect is. Right. Thank you.